everybody, and welcome to another Top 5 board gaming video. Today is a very special video for a couple of different reasons. First and foremost, this is actually a request from EAG. So, very happy to do this for you. The second reason that this is very special is because this is one that will be very much grounded in reality, because we are talking all about games about history. Now, the thing is that I took a very literal interpretation on this. So that means that I'm going to be talking about games that are based off of very well-documented historical events and that unfortunately happened very recently. When I was coming up with my list, I thought of a couple of different ways to do it. There's a lot of games that go abstract with history. For example, Imperial was one that I really wanted to do, where you can control countries based off of stock, essentially. You've got the Manhattan Project, which, yes, you are building an atomic bomb, but it's completely out of context of what was actually going on at the time. And then, of course, you've got the video that I did on Myths and Legends, where we talked about like Shadows over Camelot, the Arthurian legends. We know that there was a King Arthur, but yeah, everything gets expanded and hyperbolized and all that kind of stuff. And then you've also got all of the things about Greek and Roman mythology. You've got Cyclades or Cyclades, however you want to pronounce it, Olympia, mythic battles. You got all sorts of different stuff like this. And the thing is that, yes, you can argue that they're in historical context, and there's another good example is Seven Wonders, where Seven Wonders is based off of real features. It's based off of actual structures and things of that nature, but the gameplay itself really has nothing to do with history. So the thing is that, like I said, I really wanted to ground this as much as possible in reality, even though I do love all these other games. I love Kemet, I love Cyclades especially. I do love mythology, but for the purpose of this video, I wanted to talk more about actual more based in fact information rather than stories handed down type of thing. So with that, I hope that you enjoy this. It obviously did reduce the number of choices that I had, so some of the feedback I do want to hear is what you all consider to be a historical game. Would you consider something like the Manhattan Project to be historical even though it's out of context? Would you consider something like The New Science to be a historical game? It talks about scientific invention, but it's in a very narrow context, and again, it's very abstract. So I'm very curious as to what you guys think of that. But that said, we're going to go ahead and get started with my personal number 5. At number 5, I've got what is essentially a series of games that are solely based around putting events in a specific order. That is Timeline. That's right. In this case, I have the Timeline Inventions game, but there are numerous different ones of this. You've got drama, you've got music, you've got movies, you got historical events, American history, world history, blah blah blah, etc. Now, I know, before you guys mention it, I know that a lot of the dates in this are wrong. A lot of the dates across these games are actually incorrect, but the entire point of this game is that you're just trying to put events in a chronological order. And what is that if not history? You are talking about actual historical events that actually occurred, and by and large, we do know that they happened. We know when they happened. And the thing is that the reason this is lower on the list is simply because of the nature of the game itself. It's a very small game. It's just a card game. It's meant to be very quick, and it's not meant to be like a real thinking game, whereas most of the other ones that I'm going to be talking about are really like heavily thinking games. But even so, as far as historical context and a game about history, it's really tough to beat a game where the entire premise is history. So with that, Timeline is my number 5. At number 4, I've got a game that is very similar in the context to At number 4, I've got a game that is very similar in context to Timeline, the series of those games. It's another small card game that I actually talked about relatively recently in one of my other videos. Chrononauts. Chrononauts is a great, awesome little game, and it's a ton of fun where the entire point is that you are creating time paradoxes. The reason that I really like this game is you start off with what we would consider a canonical timeline. This is what happened, we know this is what happened, and all this kind of stuff. The thing that I love about this game is that it's all about alternate history. It's all about what ifs. Like, what if JFK wasn't assassinated? What if the Titanic hadn't sunk? What if Sputnik was unsuccessfully launched? All that kind of stuff. And the thing is, it's really cool because you can actually go onto their website and you can see the designer's reasoning for why the different paradoxes occur and what fixes them and like what happens instead, essentially. So it's a very, very cool game. It's a lot of fun. Again, very similar in general, very general concept to Timeline, where the whole point is that you've got events in chronological order. But Chrononauts really takes it a step further because the whole point is that you're really delving into that time travel thing. Plus it has a great humorous element, which I absolutely love. It makes for a ton of fun, but again, similarly to Timeline, and why this is lower on the list is because it's not as serious as what most people would probably consider a historical game should be. Again, it's really debatable. This is definitely historical. It has dates, it has times, it has it can bring up some very interesting questions with your group, all of that kind of stuff. And in the end, it's fun. So what more do you really want? But either way, Chrononauts, my number 4. I've got a game that is part of a set of games that are actually both on this list. The next one will be in just a little bit, y'all will see. But the first one for this list at number 3 is Labyrinth, The War on Terror. Now, Labyrinth and its sister game, which I will talk about in just a little bit. If you don't know, then seriously, you haven't watched enough of my videos, okay? But either way, Labyrinth, The War on Terror, the whole point is that you've got a large map that is primarily the Middle East, but also like the Indo-Pakistani region as well as North Africa and all that kind of area. Essentially where we were hearing news about the War on Terror for a decade. And the reason that I really like this game, or these sets of games, is because of how accurately abstract they are. And even as I say that, I know it doesn't really make sense, so I'm going to try to explain it. When I say that, I mean it takes a very, very intricate and delicate concept, in this case the turning tides of war from one side to another, opponent to another, etc., etc., and it turns it into something that's abstract enough that it can be made into a board game, but understanding enough and sensical enough or sensible enough that you can really see it and understand what's going on and really grasp the ramifications of specific actions during the game. The really big thing that sets this game apart is the cards. The cards are based off of real events, or you've got real legislation. For example, the Patriot Act is one of the big things in here. All of this kind of stuff. And that is really what sets this game apart as far as a historical context. I don't know if I necessarily use this to teach history and what actually occurred. You technically can, and it's kind of cool in the booklet. It tells you like the actual timeline of events that the game goes over and all that kind of stuff. So it is very, very interesting in that sense. But at the same time, it's a little bit more abstract than its sister game, which is why it's lower on the list, because you're talking about the terrorism ideal. And the problem is the publishers and the designer really had to come up with a way to make an ideal and like an amalgamous group of people something that you could actually play as and against at the same time. Now, obviously, war games really fit the bill for this type of list, simply because they're war games. That's really what they're all about. They're about wars, and more often than not, they're about wars that actually occurred, and they really need to be relatively accurate. So I will tell you right now that my top 3 games, so Labyrinth being number 3, are all war games. But suffice it to say, Labyrinth is a great game. It does a really amazing job of not showcasing, but again, abstractly demonstrating exactly what's going on during the war, how the war progressed, and all that kind of stuff. Now, again, obviously, we know what happened at the end of the war, so any game like this is going to be abstract and not precisely historical, but the cards, absolutely amazing. Being able to read up on the events is really, really fun for me personally, but Labyrinth, either way, is my number 3. I have got this sister game that we have heard so much about in the last couple of minutes. The sister game to Labyrinth, which is Twilight Struggle. That's right, Twilight Struggle, which is the game of the Cold War. Rather than the War on Terror for Labyrinth, this is the Cold War. If you have played either one of these, then you know the mechanics for the other one. They are very, very similar, but I really prefer Twilight Struggle for a couple of reasons. First off, whenever Labyrinth was made, the War on Terror was still going on. So there were still a lot of events that the game missed out on. Not that it was in any way inaccurate, but at the same time, looking at the box, you can even see it says, you know, it's when it starts, and then it has a question mark as when it ends, because it wasn't over at the time. Excuse me. But you can see here, it says the Cold War, and it gives you the exact dates here of 1945 to 1989. In other words, when World War II ended up to when the Berlin Wall fell. But again, the biggest thing for this game, the thing that I absolutely love the most, are those cards. The way that this game works with those cards and the way that the influence works, the fact that you're talking about the entire world, because this was a worldwide event. Even though you're talking about the US versus Russia in the context of the game, you are talking about the entire world with regard to what the events were that made the Cold War happen and made it progress one way or the other, and bringing us to the brink and back and all that kind of stuff. It's absolutely incredible. And on top of that, I love the fact that we've got the early, mid, and late wars. We got that in Labyrinth as well, but I really prefer the progression that Twilight Struggle makes. I think that it's kind of like an Act 1, 2, and 3 type of thing, and if you've played it enough, then you know when to start working on certain aspects of the board, and when to start trying to get into certain areas within the board and things of that nature. So it's amazingly fun in that sense. Again, very abstract, but at the same time so heavily strategic and so much fun, and an amazing amount of replayability, simply because you randomize the cards. The cards never actually change. The setup never really changes. It's rare that you have setups that differ very heavily. You do get to pick where your initial influence is in some sections, but they're standard setups, essentially, and people rarely go against what those actually are. But like I said, this has the same sorts of thing as with Labyrinth, where you can look in the instruction booklet and you can see information about every single card, every single event that the cards represent, every single piece of legislation, etc., etc. There's an incredible amount of information in this, and as you're playing, it can really feel like you are actually in there, like when you play the Quagmire card, or when you play Reagan's speech or Kennedy's speech in front of the Berlin Wall, all that kind of stuff. It's absolutely incredible, and it's just a lot of fun, and really just a great historical game. Again, obviously a war game, but history, what are you going to do? That's really where a lot of the history is. But if you have ever wondered about the Cold War, this is actually a pretty decent way to buff up your knowledge just a little bit. But with that, I'll stop rambling about it. Number 2, Twilight Struggle. At number 1, I've got a game that I absolutely love. This is something that is incredibly fun and one that I really enjoy and that I have talked about many times, but never really in this context, mostly because it's something that you don't really hear about as far as historical context is concerned. But those of us who know really know what it's all about. Aliens. No? Oh. Sorry about that. Just kidding. The actual number 1 game is actually one that I don't own, unfortunately. But like I said, it is actually another war game, and in this case, it is Memoir 44. That's right. You guys thought that I would get through a historical game list without talking about one thing from World War II? No. Not in the slightest. Now, obviously, the other game that I do own that was a serious contender for this particular spot was Axis and Allies. I don't know if you can actually see it, but I am pointing to it. So Axis and Allies and Memoir 44 are relatively similar in the context of, obviously, they talk about World War II, and they are large-scale strategic games. The thing is that Memoir 44 is a relatively simplified war game, something that a lot of people really aren't used to. So you're talking about very few players, and you're talking about, you know, essentially one side versus the other side, and blah, 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 blah. The reason that I really prefer Memoir 44 in the historical context, though, is because of things like the campaign booklets. Now, what these have is these have actual historical battles from World War II, and you can recreate those in Memoir 44, and you can fight in those battles. You've got different terrain types, you've got information about the battles themselves, so you can read about what happened, who was fighting, all of that kind of stuff. It's absolutely incredible, and it really reminds me of, if you've ever seen it, the TV show Band of Brothers, because you can feel like you're actually in there, you can feel like you're in there with the guys, and it's absolutely an amazing experience and a ton of fun. But really, that's the only thing for me personally that greatly separates Memoir 44 from something like Axis and Allies. Obviously, with Axis and Allies, you can have the big giant board where you combine the Pacific and the Atlantic regions, or the Pacific and the European, technically, regions, and things of that nature. But at the same time, it doesn't give nearly as much information. I talked about Labyrinth and I talked about Twilight Struggle, which give a lot of information about the history that you're playing through. And that, again, is really what pushed Memoir 44 over the top for me personally. And that is why it is my personal number 1. Alright folks, well that's it for me. I hope that you enjoyed this video on my top 5 historical games. Once again, I want to specifically thank EAG for requesting this video. It was something that was actually a very good idea. I had sort of debated about doing it, and I really hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, please give me particularly your feedback on my interpretation of what a historical game is. Would you consider games about mythology and even something about like a mythos, like Arkham Horror? Would you consider that to be a historical game because it's about like stories and things of that nature? I'm very, very curious what you guys think. Obviously curious to hear what you guys have to say about my own personal choices, what your own choices would be as well. Would you go more World War II? Would you go World War I? I know there are some Revolutionary War games. Unfortunately, I haven't really played very many of them, so I can't speak to them with any sort of intellect. But regardless, thank you very, very much again for watching this video, and I will see you next time. Thank you again for watching my top 5 favorite historical board games. I wanted to once again thank EAG for the suggestion, and again, please let me know what your guys' feedback is. Would you consider other games to be historically correct? Would you not? Do you want to stick with this kind of thing? Did I not have nearly enough World War II? What do you guys think? You know that I love to hear everything that you guys have to say. As always, I've got several of my playlists linked up at the top of the page so that you can see more of my stuff, and be sure to follow me on Twitter at DannyCGamingSci so you can see when I post new videos and when I start live streaming video games. Thank you very much again, and I will see you next time.